Even hours after news of his death, flags in the Russian capital were still flying at full staff. Boris Yeltsin may have been this country's first president, but he was for many Russians deeply unpopular. His legacy is one of freedom mixed with chaos.
He did right when he opened the borders. We're now able to travel around the world. We got some conception of democracy with Yeltsin. We became free people.
He started well, but his leadership brought Russia to a condition where I feel embarrassed about my country. All his drunk tricks. I am ashamed of him.
This is the iconic image of Yeltsin defying communist hardliners during a 1991 coup attempt. He went on to oversee the demise of the Soviet Union, bringing democracy and capitalism to Russia. He brought Vladimir Putin to power too, handpicking the former KGB officer as his presidential successor. For many observers of Russia, this may remain one of his enduring legacies. Under Vladimir Putin, the instability of Yeltsin's Russia has faded into memory. Flush with oil cash, Russians are feeling increasingly proud of their nation, and the Kremlin is being increasingly assertive on the international stage. But critics of today's Kremlin say things have gone way too far. It's curtailed civil liberties and rolled back on democratic freedoms that Boris Yeltsin fought hard to achieve. Yeltsin's democratic credentials were far from perfect. Faced with an armed rebellion in 1993, he ordered tanks to fire on his own parliament, crushing resistance. Then there was his war in Chechnya. Tens of thousands died and are still dying in a conflict that rumbles on under his successor, President Putin. But under Putin, Kremlin critics say the Yeltsin-era promises of a prosperous and democratic Russia were never kept. The result, they say, is bitter disappointment.
Since 2004, 2005, there was a growing sense of frustration. Why the country is rich, is getting richer, and we're not getting rich. In fact, the living conditions are deteriorating, have been deteriorating, and people just don't recognize why at the time when a country enjoys, such tremendous benefits from high energy prices, the living conditions for most Russians deteriorating.
In his final years, Yeltsin did criticize Putin. His reinstating of the Soviet national anthem, his record on press freedom. But it's not altogether clear what Yeltsin would have done differently. And with a record of decline when in office, few Russians believe he'd have done it any better. Matthew Chance, CNN Moscow.
December 31st, 1999. Boris Yeltsin walked away from it all. The presidency, the power, the prestige.
Today, on the last day of the departing century, I am resigning.
His staff and the nation were in shock. But Yeltsin, in his memoirs, says, "To my surprise, I realized I was in a good mood, a very good, cheerful mood." He handed over the so-called nuclear suitcase, which controls Russia's missiles, to his hand-picked successor, Vladimir Putin. "Now I was no longer responsible for the nuclear suitcase and the nuclear button," he wrote. "Maybe I would finally get rid of my insomnia." And so the man whom many accused of being addicted to power was now a pensioner. And he began recording his memoirs for a third and last autobiography, which he would call in Russian Presidential Marathon. But he stayed away from politics. His old friend Bill Clinton visited him at his country dacha. He met occasionally with the new Russian President Vladimir Putin, not as an advisor, he said, but as someone to talk with who knows a lot. He criticized Mr. Putin for bringing back the old Soviet anthem. He said he regretted leaving two difficult decisions to Mr. Putin, whether to remove Lenin's body from its mausoleum on Red Square and whether to outlaw the Communist Party. At the height of his Kremlin power, Boris Yeltsin told CNN he's not concerned about his role in history.
Concerning history, I want to dispense with that issue immediately. I am not thinking about history at all, and I'm not planning on thinking about it. I'm thinking about deeds.
But Boris Yeltsin now is part of history. More than 3/4 of his countrymen think the Yeltsin era brought Russia more bad than good. Political observers see two sides to Boris Yeltsin.
He will be remembered as a very talented, very gifted politician, but a hopeless statesman. He knew how to get to power. He knew how to keep in power, but he didn't know quite well what to do with the power that he had.
Another man who once ruled the Kremlin calls Yeltsin power-hungry.
Of course he was no Democrat. He came to power adjusting his point of view, deceiving, saying he's against privileges, a great Democrat. He climbed up on a tank, but it was all deception.
Boris Yeltsin, in his last book, saw it differently. I gave it my all, he writes. I put my whole heart and soul into running my presidential marathon. I honestly went the distance. If I have to justify anything, here is what I will say. If you think you can do it better, just try. Run those 40,000 kilometers. Try to do it faster, better, more elegantly, or more easily. Because I did it. Jill Doherty, CNN, Moscow.
Подождет на грешники сечи, огни, жуткины, курень, чаши им, яко праведен Господи правды, правоты види лице Его. Слава, яко Господи в плоти праведный, советничего посрамися, Господь же упование Его есть, кто даст от всего на спасение Израилева, судьи земли и люди, век Господь, всяко тени свои огни, множишься немощи их, посих ускориша, и соберу соборы их откровения, помяну же имени их устнам моима, Господь, часть достояния моего и чаша моя, одесную меня есть, да не подвижуся, Иоанне, и же даться преподобному Твоему видеть исцеление, сказал Месси пути живота, исполнишь меня веселье с лицем Твоим, красота в деснице Твоей конец, слава